Welcome to Transrational Perspectives. I'm Shawn Bryant, and this is Noah Taylor. In this episode, Noah, who is the host of the channel, will be talking about his doctoral thesis on mysticism and conflict transformation. Our aim is to offer unique perspectives on peace and conflict transformation, and also open up discussions more generally on research and peace studies. So Noah's thesis is entitled "The Power, Path, Voice, and Vision of the Peaceful Warrior, How Mysticism Can Be Used to Understand Conflict Transformation." The abstract goes on to say, this doctoral dissertation provides an in-depth analysis of how mysticism can be used to better understand the theory and practice of conflict transformation. The dissertation begins with a comprehensive survey of mysticism, which leads to a precise description of its relevance to conflict transformation. Next, the dissertation clearly situates this conflict transformation research within the transrational approach pioneered by Dr. Wolfgang Dietrich, UNESCO Chair for Peace Studies at the University of Innsbruck, Austria. This dissertation then highlights the key points of the relationship between mysticism and conflict transformation as a prelude to proposing the peaceful warrior archetype as a way of expressing the relationship between conflict transformation and mysticism. A comprehensive discussion of the peaceful warrior archetype is then undertaken through an examination of its archetypal components. The compass of the peaceful warrior is then offered as a model for working with the peaceful warrior archetype in peace education and in applied peace work. A case study is then presented to demonstrate the relevance of this model. This dissertation then concludes with a final synthesis of all the key findings and proposes future lines of research. So, to start off our discussion, there's a lot of terminology there that we might need to unpack. But let's start off. What is mysticism? What is it? What does the academic literature say about it? And also, what is mysticism for you?
Thanks, Shawn, and thanks for the opportunity to have this space to talk about something that occupied many years of my life and attention and effort. The idea of working with mysticism is kind of on one level a strange topic, and this can be a tricky thing. When I began this journey of my research, I went to interview Swami Veda Parvati, I asked him the question, "What is mysticism?" And he responded by saying, "Direct experience of God." So that pretty much sums it up. While quite poignant and beautiful, I was sitting there thinking, like, well, shit, how am I going to turn this into an academic paper? He then went on to say that we can understand mysticism as any philosophical and mental practices used to fulfill the aspiration for direct experience of God. You can feel it in every which way. So I saw the initial task of my research to be filling it in every which way. When you start looking at how mysticism has been understood, you get many different ideas. I mean, the word itself originates from the ancient Greek meaning secrets or secret, and it usually referred to people that were initiates of secretive religious orders and mystery cults. And so the mystic was someone who belonged to this kind of group. Something that today we might...
Secret connects to the idea of mystery that we have in
right.
The same root in contemporary English.
Yes, exactly. And I think, and maybe I'll just talk about the two most famous definitions and how they kind of fit together. The first real book on mysticism as a topic was written by an English Catholic pacifist, Evelyn Underhill. And she said it's the science of a self-evident reality that cannot be reasoned about because it's the object of pure reason. But what was interesting to this definition is she also said that it was an innate tendency of the human spirit towards a transcendental order by whichever way we happen to understand it. So it brings in this aspect of it being a part of what it means to be human. And
can you explain a little bit more what Underhill means by this transcendental order?
Yes, because Evelyn Underhill would be a mystic in the Catholic tradition, one that posits the existence of God. And as we'll discuss mysticism, we start to see there's a bit of a difference between how mysticism is understood when there is this concept of divinity and when there's not. So in a Catholic sense, the notion of God is that it's an omnipotent and omnipresent deity that exists transcendent to the individual. And so in trying to
That means
seek
like
communion,
above and beyond the individual.
exactly.
Right?
And so that what the mystic is doing is trying to seek God in that way. And so we have this is quite a religious definition of mysticism.
Okay.
Whereas if we look from more of an academic approach, William James, one of the founders of what we now understand as humanistic psychology, he wrote this quite famous book called The Variety of Religious Experiences, where he wanted to understand people that have these kinds of experiences, particularly because he said he has never had one. So he was quite curious about it. And he lays out 4 key qualities, and he says the first 2 are the most important. And the first is ineffability. That means a mystical experience defies expression, that it cannot be spoken about in words, which when you hear this as a, academic at the beginning of your research, you're like, well, shit, how am I going to integrate the concept, operationalize the definition of ineffability? And with this, he pairs it the notion that a mystical experience has a noetic quality. And noetic, in this sense, means direct experience of knowing. So you have this experience and you know it to be true. It can't be any other way. And for him, in a more secular sense, he defines it based on the nature of the experience itself, whereas Underhill kind of understands it based on this Catholic understanding of divinity.
So that, just to try to clarify and understand what James means by this noetic experience. That means like you don't think about it in like a cognitive way and then understand it and then make meaning from it. Like, I was like, oh, I saw this, and I don't know, I saw a dove, and that's a symbol of peace, and therefore that means this like this peaceful experience. But rather, you have this like direct, this direct experience that bypasses in your cognitive analysis of it. Is that what it would be like?
Yeah. Well, one of the parallels he draws, or him or one of his students, I'm not sure exactly who it was, is he makes it equivalent to the flinch reflex. So if something's about to poke you in the eye, your eye will close. But if you measure what's happening in the brain, there isn't a signal going to the brain. Your eye itself is deciding to close. It has a self-protective mechanism. And so they see a parallel between what a noetic experience is that it's something that feels so true that you would not question it.
I see. What I also wanted to ask is, when and how did you first get the idea that there was a meaningful connection between mysticism and conflict transformation?
I think that there's several intersecting lines that drew my attention there. And the first is, if I'm very honest about my own perspective, is that these are things that I've always been interested in since I was a child, things that could broadly be defined under this category of mysticism. I spent a lot of time learning about meditation and contemplative practice, martial arts, psychic phenomena, and altered states of consciousness, magic, these kinds of things. And so in one way, I'm always looking for where I see a connection with this. And the more time
you were destined to study this in a way.
Yeah. And then the more time I spent in peace studies, the more I started to see these connections. And to me, it's very, I can see a moment, an episode where this really rang true for me. And it was when I was teaching in India, and we had, I was a seminar leader, and we had students doing group papers. And so there's all this tension that was arising in the room because it was the end of the semester and the students were doing their group papers. And it was hot, and you could feel the tension in the room. It was not a good atmosphere. And then my colleague came in and had, as a way of intervening into this situation, she sent the professor out of the room, had all the students remove the desks from the room, and told everyone to not talk and to stand up and to show with their bodies how they felt about their group paper process. And they made these kind of grotesque pictures. and she had them hold it for quite a while,
kind of
like several minutes.
Like some image theater technique.
Right. Yeah. And like move closer to the people in your group and feel in that space. And she went, I don't remember exactly the process, but moving through different things like this. And I swear there was a moment where I heard a cracking sound. And then everything went, whew, and like many people in the room started crying. And then after that, everything was just kind of okay. Like the professor came back in the room and was like, what happened? Everything seems fine now. And at this point, I had 2 master's degrees in peace studies, and I was like, I don't know what the hell happened in this moment. And so I think as like something that started my inquiry into this, it was like, well, if this was a mystery and mysticism is a way of approaching the mystery, then maybe this is a way of beginning.
A way of approaching like the ineffable of what happened in the room, right?
And one thing that I came to see later after finishing the dissertation, and I didn't understand it at this way going through it, but for me, it was also studying mysticism in this way was a kind of revivification or a reconciliation of myself with the larger idea of what it means to be in academia. And that I started to see, I wouldn't really call it a secret history, but more like a not spoken history of the relationship between things we could largely call mysticism and what we would call like a modern academic perspective. And even the word itself, academia, it comes from a word that means to sit among the groves. And these are groves near Athens where you would sit with your teacher and you would learn. But these are the same groves that were dedicated to Athena, who is the goddess of wisdom, courage, inspiration, and peace. And one of the anecdotes that I saw in looking at things this way was, if we think about what a scientific or an academic perspective is, and based on a modern framework, we in telling that story and telling that history, we would of course bring up Rene Descartes. And there's a part in one of Rene Descartes' story when he was young, about 19 or 20, and he was soldiering across Europe, and he was stationed somewhere slightly outside of Ulm in Germany, which was coincidentally where Einstein was born. And one summer at night, he had this really powerful dream, something that we would say verges on something that could be called a vision. And in this dream, an angel came to him and said, the conquest of nature is to be achieved through number and measure. And this had a very profound effect on him. And this is a strange story because it, in one way, through at least Descartes' influence, the nature of what it means to have an academic perspective is partially built on a mystical experience. But this is not really how this story is told. And I think that's one of the things I started to take away in the years after I finished the dissertation and started to notice the impacts that it had on me.
Yeah, I read a little bit about that story, and I incorporated it into my lectures this last semester, exactly because of I think the reasons we're talking about that like the Descartes bashing is kind of like a postmodernist sport these days.
Right, yes.
And yet I think really to understand like where he came from, and I think it also like you're saying, kind of repositions the whole his whole contribution to say Western academia, realizing or knowing these kind of like mystical origins to his approach to science, and that it came at a time when this was like it was radical and revolutionary, and also motivated by his spirituality.
And then it makes you wonder how many other things have a story like this shaping them that you don't know.
Yeah, I was reading a book about zero, or the concept of zero. I think the author was Zeife. And one of the things I really liked about it that's really stuck in my mind was talking about Descartes. And he said that zero is like the divine number, like the origin source, and that this was so important to Descartes that he put it at the center of his Cartesian plane. And in English we call that the 0 point of the XY axis, the origin, as like the source, right? The source of everything, the Godhead.
And I think for me, these kinds of things bring a sense of vitality back to what sometimes can feel like a rather dry endeavor, or an endeavor that's a bit removed from vitality. If you're thinking about academic work, you think about something that's just kind of very, linear and methodological and doesn't really tap into these things so clearly. But I think that that's kind of a false perception about what this work really can be, or what the options are.
Yeah, I think I've told you the story before that I was at a conference in Vienna and talking to a guy who was doing some research on something in history, and it said, yes, academic work is like digging a tunnel by yourself underground. You don't know if someone's coming the other way. You don't know if someone's going to come and intersect you. Like, this is not an inspirational metaphor.
Right.
No. So you draw on a lot of different ideas or imagery for trying to explain this connection between mysticism and conflict transformation. You have like the compass, and the 4 points, and also the archetype of the peaceful warrior, which in understood in a very simplistic way could be a contradiction in terms, an oxymoron. Right. So I wanted to ask you, what was the inspiration for the archetype of the peaceful warrior? Like, what did you draw on, and what does it mean to you?
At that point of the research and the writing, I had gone so far as to do a deep dive into what is mysticism and all the different ways we can think about it and look at it. And then what is conflict transformation in a similar manner. And then I had distilled these 7 or so points that I thought were important ways that these two ways of practicing and perceiving fit together. But then the question for me is, well, what do you do with this nice list of these things, right? It's like, okay, well, that's good, but what next? And that's what led me back to this concept of the archetype, and trying to answer, how do you use these connections in some kind of practical sense? Jung thought of the archetypes as being prime imprinters, and they build on his idea of the collective unconscious, that there's some kind of secondary psychic system, something that's universal and impersonal, and that while each person in their uniqueness manifests these archetypes, there is something that we inherit that sits between and amongst many different cultures. So if you look at the concepts of the hero or the magician or the trickster, these show up in many different cultures at many different times, and you can see them manifest through the results, through stories and through myths and through art. I heard someone once say that the archetype was trying to reconcile Darwin and God. How do you fit together the idea of hereditary influence on behavior and the environment, particularly at the time that Jung was writing? And one of the ways that Jung started to conceptualize the archetype later in his life was as a pattern of awareness. And this is what really stuck with me, and which was my impetus for calling out this idea of the peaceful warrior, both as something that I thought existed already in maybe a different ways and derived from a few different types of archetypes, which I can talk about. But also I had this idea of archetypal engineering. So with the idea of can I intentionally build on some of these foundational blocks to create kind of a cognitive technology that allows one to operate a pattern of awareness from this intersection of mysticism and conflict transformation. And of course, the word itself, when you say the peaceful warrior, the thing that comes to most people's mind is the series of novels written by Dan Millman, and the movie that came afterwards, which is a semi-autobiographical account of his relationship with his kind of spiritual mentor. And it follows a lot of these steps that are quite typical in these stories. The kind of initiatory phase, the disillusion phase, and where he ends up becoming transformed into a different type of awareness and a different type of person. And though I had read that book, that wasn't really the main inspiration for me. In trying to figure out what an archetype would be at this intersection, I saw it as being a combination of the healer archetype, or maybe more specifically in the Jungian sense, the wounded healer archetype, which we can see in things like the myth of Chiron, which is about how the doctor learns to heal through using their own wounds as the healing force. And then I saw this in conjunction with what we call the hero archetype, and how bringing these two together I saw as what I would call the peaceful warrior. And I think you see bits of it in different places, like the Budo tradition from the culture around the samurai, from the martial arts such as Aikido, practices such as karma yoga, I think exemplify different aspects of what I was pointing towards. And so I tried to draw from all of these together and call this thing the peaceful archetype as a place to stand where you can work in a pattern of awareness from the intersection of mysticism and conflict transformation.
Well, what are some of the defining characteristics of a peaceful warrior, or of the archetype of the peaceful warrior?
I think that one is being able to operate in many ways of having both, in that something can be a perspective and also a practice. So I think this is something that we see as common between mysticism and conflict transformation, is that conflict transformation is a perspective, right? It's a way, it can be understood as a way of looking at and understanding conflict. And it's also a way of describing particular approaches to dealing with conflict and for transforming conflict. And in the same way, the mysticism can refer to kind of the larger idea of what mysticism says about the world, but it can also refer to the actual experiences and practices used by mystics. And to this, I would also add that brings up an occupation with, or preoccupation with, a similar epistemology, that between both mysticism and conflict transformation, there is intentional value placed on lived experience, and also lived experience in a given context as an important source of information. Mm-hmm. And I think then building again from that, there's this notion of the mind, or what we call the mind and the brain, in looking at a self-reflective lens about awareness itself. So I think when we talk about conflict transformation, particularly in training for conflict transformation, we stress this idea of cultivating the internal observer. Can I be aware of what I'm thinking and feeling in a given moment? And also this self-reflective awareness is part and parcel of what most mystical traditions would consider the great work, is that this capacity to be able to see yourself selfing is a precursor to being able to go beyond the self. It's being able to see the bars of your prison before you learn how to pick the lock. And then from there,
little analogy.
And from there, I think it spins into more of the ideas of meaning making. So what are the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, and how much do we believe those stories? And we see this in conflict, of course. There's certain narratives that take primary focus in a conflict, and we think that's the whole truth. And we have the same experience as individuals. We think we are the story we tell ourselves about who we are. But in both conflict transformation and mysticism, there's a bit of this flip where you realize, oh, well, there's more space there. The awareness gives a larger space to have more than just that. So I think these are aspects of what the peaceful warrior taps into. Mm-hmm.
And drawing on that, then what is the role of paradox in the connection between mysticism and conflict transformation? And here I think you're drawing on the work of Jean-Paul Lederach to bring in this idea of paradox as one of the steps of conflict transformation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Lederach, he talks about the idea of cultivating paradoxical curiosity as one of the key disciplines for the development of what he calls the moral imagination.
Yeah.
And the idea of a paradox is quite interesting. It's something that, on one level might seem absurd or seem self-contradictory, but on another level might express a possible truth. And if we look at
just
the
like
word,
the archetype of the peaceful warrior, right?
Yes,
on
exactly.
One level, there's this
peace and war.
And peace are commonly considered as opposites, and yet when you're combining these two, if you're able to get past the cognitive dissonance of these two opposing words coming together to describe a single thing, then there's a possibility of a deeper truth or
Exactly.
deeper insight beyond the contradiction.
And it's that tension in the paradox, which is important both in Lederach's understanding of how it functions in conflict transformation and also with regards to mysticism. Like even the word itself, like para and doxa, it means against common belief. And so what it doesn't mean is against truth. It just means against what is currently commonly held to be true. And so it opens the door to that there might be something behind and beyond the appearance, which I think is both something that we look for in a conflict transformation approach and also, of course, part and parcel of mysticism. And I think even a lot of our modern thinking is quite shaped by these tensions that we might not even recognize. So if you think about trying to reconcile classical physics with quantum physics, how do you really deal in a rational way with the wave-particle duality? Or, we in our scientific perspective, we think of biological evolution as being true, but also the second law of thermodynamics as being true. So how can it be possible that these two things exist as truths, even though they're seemingly contradictory? And I think of mysticism as embracing this paradox as an operating principle. And it harnesses the power of that tension rather than trying to dissolve it. And it also, I think, points to entry points into non-ordinary reality, as Castaneda would call it, points where your perception and reality may not exactly fit together. And, when you read a lot of mystical texts, they sound very strange, particularly the ones that are written by mystics. And there are several possible explanations for this. One, these people are just crazy. One that I don't tend to go with, but some of them probably are. Another is that it's a byproduct of ineffability and noesis. So you experience these things that cannot be said, and then you try to write it down. And then the third is that it's a teaching tool, that they're putting the paradox there to help bring the reader to what they are perceiving.
And koan.
Exactly, like in the Rinzai school of Zen that use this koan idea, which is, the classic one is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And your teacher will give you a question like this, and then you just sit there for days or maybe years, and you have to contemplate it. But the interesting part about the practice is it's not just the contemplation. I think it's every week or maybe every month, you have to sit in front of your teacher and give an answer to the question. And so you have this pressure. And there's also other students there, and every once in a while, a student will get it right and move on to the next level. And so you have this stress that builds up after day and month, years, that you're not getting the answer to the question. And a study that was done, I think in the 80s, and it's one of these things that's interesting, but you don't really know what it means. They were scanning the brains of Zen monks in this kind of school. And they noticed that whenever this teacher said that the student was correct, the answer was correct, there was a different brainwave state manifesting that student than there was previously. And what they also noticed that sometimes the student would have given word for word the same answer that they had given previously, but the teacher had kind of approved the answer to the question when there was something different going on in the brain. But he didn't have access to the brain scanner. He didn't know that this is what was going on. But it points to something kind of weird, And I think that, even if we think of it outside of the Zen idea, in my understanding of Christianity, at the heart of it is a lot of paradoxes. The idea of how does an omniscient and omnipresent God relate to a finite individual, like understanding the true nature of the Trinity. What is the relationship between God and free will? Like, if you really seriously contemplate these questions, you can't help but run face to face with a kind of paradox. Nagarjuna, one of his pillars of Mahayana Buddhism is that samsara is nirvana and nirvana is samsara, which is that, so the manifest world where we're all bound into suffering because of our desires is the same thing as the freedom from that world. And how do you wrap your head around that without having to go right into the heart of that kind of tension of a paradox?
Well, maybe this is a good segue into another thing I wanted to ask about. One of the parts of your text that really stood out to me as a good way of trying to understand mysticism, also as a good say learning tool or a good teaching tool, is when you compare and contrast the mystics and their approaches to the mystical experiences. I think you do it through about maybe 5 or 6 different traditions. But I would just wanted to ask you to do that, elaborate and compare and contrast mystics from Christianity, Sufism, Tantra, and Buddhism.
Sure, yeah, and it's interesting when you look at these kinds of things because you can't help but take broad strokes because you have the idea of what is the faith tradition and what do individual mystics say they experience, and then try to say something generally speaking. But when you look at different mystical traditions, I think you kind of have, the way I divide it up is that they differ depending on how you understand the nature of what ultimate reality is, how you are currently in relationship to it, and how you're going about getting there, wherever there is for you.
Very basic, like ontological questions.
Yeah, exactly. So if we think about it from a Christian mystic perspective, like in a Christian worldview, humans are created by God. So they exist in some way in relation to God, but they're not necessarily in communion with God. So the goal is to get to God somehow. And so we're in the Christian conception, we're removed several layers from the divine. So all of the approaches to accessing God revolve around softening or dismantling these barriers to get to a point where you can receive the grace of God. And this is William James' third point of the mystical experience, is passivity. That at some point there is no more doing that can be done. Like there is no more volition, there's no more self. So if you think about the way Christian mystic paths are described, they usually follow something like a first step of renunciation, where one is, usually you go to a monastery, you're cutting off worldly attachments, trying to dismantle your attachment to the importance of yourself. This idea of purification and making oneself ready for a new divine reality. And this is usually followed then by a way of illumination, which is once you've seen the darkness, now you can be, what is defined as the light. And you move towards that sense of illumination understood as the knowledge of God. And then these are considered precursors to what they would call the way of union, which is removing the last barriers between the individual to merge with God. And this is where mysticism in the Abrahamic sense gets interesting, because it's where mysticism and Christianity both become sanctified and heretical, because it's said that the mystic can only know God by becoming God. And this is where, the prophets or religious holy figures, I mean, Jesus, of course, being the pinnacle example in that tradition, becoming God is something that generally religions only let certain people do, and only for a little while. And so, but that's where the religion comes from, in this sense, is this experience. And so it sets the stage for this ambivalent relationship between the mystic and the orthodoxy. And then if we take Sufism, for example, which is on one way it's a little bit similar, of course, because it's a monotheistic religion of the Abrahamic school, but because Sufism is also based on pre-Islamic beliefs and traditions, it has a slightly different flavor, at least in the way that I read it, is that God is a reality, and that humans exist in a state of kind of a confused perception about our true nature of connection to God. And so then the idea of the Sufi is to live in a state of continual remembrance of God. And the idea then is to bring together the heart, the self, and the soul in order to make contact with the divine. And it's interesting to look at the poetry and the metaphors that are utilized to describe this in Sufism, because they speak of sleep and dream and forgetfulness, estrangement and longing are the common motifs. The idea of a lover separated from the beloved and seeking to return to where they came from. And so the Sufi path, rather than trying to get to something that is transcendent to you, is more a pattern of learning that you are already in communion. And this is conceptualized in different ways, but usually through what they call nafs, which are lesser souls or lesser kind of sheaths, or sometimes referred to as veils that separate us from the divine. And depending, it's a little bit like the chakra system in a way, so that it divides them up differently depending on the traditions. And then usually at each stage, there's kind of a prescribed set of prayers and rituals and fasting that you do to train each one. And this is a unique facet of Sufism, is that they don't have an emphasis on destroying the barriers. They always refer to it as training the barriers. And that there's no sense in killing your horse, they say, because these provide the energy to move you forward. You just got to make sure your horse behaves well to bring you back into this state of connection.
A well-trained horse.
A well-trained horse, exactly. So we have these, like Sufism and Christianity as an example, where it's based on this idea of a god that you're trying to get to or remember that you're part of. But then if we look at Tantra, it's a bit different. And Tantra is a bit of a strange field, because it both refers to strains of thought within Buddhism and Vedanta, but also outside of those. But generally speaking, the view is that the world is an energetic one. Everything is connected, and in the end, non-dual. Everything is inherently part of itself, and any separation is kind of an illusion. So then the goal is to realize that and to harness the energy of that in order to seek transformation. And then
in that sense, it sounds more like how you described the Sufi approach.
Yeah. I would think that one who is more well versed in Sufism and able to read Arabic than me could make a strong argument that there are tantric influences that are preserved in Sufism, probably from a much older practice. And it would make sense too, given, like, particularly in the northern part of India and near Kashmir, where there are still kinds of preserved traditions where Islam exists in Sufi orientations alongside of tantric Buddhist thought. So I think that someone could find this somewhere, and that it's a little bit hard to say what is the way of Tantra, but if you were to read a bunch of it and generalize it, there seems to be a strong emphasis on the relationship between the master and the student, particularly the master or the teacher as the guru. And so this means both the guru as the universal teaching principle, but also the guru as the individual that is the manifestation of that on earth.
Yeah,
and
that
this
reminds me of when we were talking about, say, that nothing compares with the grace of the guru.
Right,
right. And I've also taken that into consideration in teaching. And one of the things I remember reading about is that one of the things that is most important in the performance of like young people and students in actually learning and retaining information is the quality of the relationship, the teacher-student dyad. And if there is good rapport, if there's trust, if there's a positive regard from the teacher to the student, that is what matters most.
Right.
And so I can see kind of a parallel or corollary to that.
And I think this notion of guru as a principle is often referred to as the supreme teacher principle, with the idea that what the guru does in this way of thinking is the guru eats your karma. They use this phrase that you give in giving yourself over to the guru, your karma is destroyed by them eating it. And then you become free of that and able to you have the stage now set for transformation. And then the particular practices are usually then assigned to the individual student by the guru. And so what people say about Tantra is that you can't really just pick up books on Tantra and follow it, because what is written down is not really the thing itself. It's something written down for people who have undergone this initiation and know how to read it. I can't validate that that's true, only that that's what people say. And that through the grace of the guru, you are able to then follow these disciplines to get to a point of non-dual perception, and then all is energy and all is transformation. So that's quite a different orientation than as described between like Christianity's approach to mysticism and what it means in this context. And then if we take Buddhism as the last kind of example, it's, whereas Tantra perceives the entire world as energetic, interrelated, and non-dual, if we're talking about very kind of classical Buddhism, the Hinayana traditions or Theravada traditions, is that there really is, like, everything is empty. The notion of God is not important. The nature of reality is that it's an illusion. And the task is to realize that not only is the universe empty, but so are we. And so the whole Buddhist approach to transformation in the mystical sense is in a way encapsulated by the story of the Buddha, right? He was born a prince into this amazing palace where he was sequestered and given all of the earthly delight so he would never taste suffering. Eventually, he encountered the truth of the world, that suffering and impermanence exist. That led through a journey of doing all these austerities till he figured out the middle way and then reached enlightenment. So then the Buddhist mystic gets to kind of sidestep the middle step, because if you follow this, you believe that the Buddha figured it out, so you don't need to do the mistakes the Buddha did. You just follow what the Buddha did. And it's because very early Buddhism had a kind of prohibition on writing down anything related to Buddhism. Everything is very formulaic. The Buddhists are very good with lists and the order that lists should be done in. So the Buddhist path would be, realizing the Four Noble Truths, that the importance and ultimately unsatisfactory nature of life, that everything is impermanent, that this impermanence, that we desire to have some kind of permanence, this creates our suffering. This creates unsatisfactoriness. That there is a way out of the trap, and that the way out of the trap for them is this eightfold path. Like, there is an ideal form of perception, of speaking, of creating our intent, of acting, of living, of being mindful, of concentrating. And these are perceived as a wheel, as a Dali chakra, and that they're always continually in motion, and that you don't necessarily follow a progression. And that what this wheel leads to is, you could say, a noetic understanding of the three marks of existence. That all things are absent of self, that the entire world is impermanent, and the truth of suffering. And that through deep realization of this, you get to nirvana. And, we translate nirvana as enlightenment, but if you look at the word itself, it comes more close to blowing out a candle, or for suffocating a candle, removing the air from around a candle. And so on the metaphysical level, what it refers to is that you don't have to be reborn again, because this is a tradition that grew out of Vedantic ideas that you have to be reborn. And so it also means that the idea of the self is extinguished, so then there is no more suffering because you don't exist. And so we have a very different understanding of what a mystical path would be from a Buddhist perspective as opposed to a Christian or a Sufi, because the understanding of the world is different in these different traditions.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that's also a good segue to one of the things I wanted to ask, because it's I think it really ends up being like a fundamental division in these different approaches, with maybe Christianity and Sufism on one hand and the Tantra and Buddhism on the other. Can you explain the basic difference between transcendence and imminence?
Yeah, the way that this debate is usually framed in analytical philosophy comes particularly from Christian theology, and how do you answer the question, is God in the world or is God outside the world? And so on one side, on the camp of imminence, you have the idea that God is contained in the world itself, and you have someone like Hegel. And the idea of transcendence, that God is completely outside the world, is Kierkegaard. But outside of the particular theological arguments, it has a lot to do with this idea of, if we're talking about being in the present moment, for example, is that all there is what is here right now, or is there also something else? So when we speak of the idea of spirit or a soul or spirituality or the Tao or any kind of these potentially mystical concepts, are we talking about something like gravity, which is a force that's always there in nature? Or is it something that's a higher order, somehow removed from us? And then the question is, well, how are these two things related? Because of course you could say, well, both are true, but then the question is, how are you true? And the idea that, are we, we are human beings having a spiritual experience, or spirits having a human experience, or spirit having a human experience. These things all relate to very different understandings of the nature between transcendence and imminence. And I think that even these ideas show up quite in maybe slightly less esoteric sounding ways when we were doing the work of conflict transformation. So, Lederach just says that the heart of what the work of conflict transformation is how do you see beyond and transcend the cycles of day-to-day violence while remaining in touch with the lived realities. And so this is also this question of transcendence and imminence. Like, how do you look beyond the here and now while still being in the here and now? Lederach also speaks of the 200-year present, so that we should always conceive of ourselves as holding hands 100 years behind us with 100 years holding in front of us, which again is, reading the textbooks of peace study sounds like a very good idea. But then when it comes into putting this into practice, it's really a trick of how you bring together transcendence and imminence, because if you are, working in a situation of ongoing violent conflict, it's not going to inspire much confidence in your approach if you're like, well, the changes that we're putting in place now in 100 years will lead to transformation in the future. Because, okay, yeah, good, but that's not helping anyone who is sitting there in the room with you right now. And then also you have, donors to report back to, and you're monitoring and evaluation, and they're not going to be very happy with
They're
this.
not
this
thinking
approach.
of the 200-year perspective.
No. and so, this is, again, I think where, transcendence and imminence and the relationship between them is in a way this paradox once again. Is how do you deal with two things that are seemingly contradictory, but I guess we confront all the time? That even the idea of Noah as an existing entity. Like, there is this story of Noah of, since childhood, I had these experiences in these places and I learned these things. And that's more of the transcendent experience of Noah, because I can't go talk to that Noah in the past anymore. He doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is the imminence of Noah. But somehow they are in relationship to each other, if only preserved through memory. But then the fact that other people know Noah as well speaks to another version of the intersection between transcendence and imminence.
Well, we haven't even talked about the kind of the big central part of your thesis, being the power, path, vision, and voice. One thing I want to maybe just ask you to talk a little bit about, what really jumped out at me from rereading your text was something you wrote about the voice part of the compass, and you relate the 4 points: power, path, vision, voice to 4 different chakras in the sort of Tantra yoga tradition, and relate voice to the Vishuddha chakra of the throat, and saying that in the kind of conventional conflict resolution model, kind of the Uri and Fisher ideas of getting to yes, of interest-based conflict resolution, or an interest-based collaborative approach, right, is the importance of moving off of positions and towards your needs or interests. And you make the connection that the activating or opening of the voice of the Vishuddha chakra is the a kind of a parallel or corollary to actually being able to express those things, express what your needs are. And I could understand it then as, of a position of saying what I think I want, my proposed solution to the problem. It would be perhaps something that comes from the mind, a cognitive construct, maybe. And in that sense, I would I would connect that to perhaps the like anahata chakra, and saying that what you need is to be able to really connect to your ability to express yourself. And that is what is necessary to be able to clearly express what are your needs, what are your interests, and to do it in a way that is vulnerable and open, and rather than the defensive or safe position of the cognitive construct of my position. I was wondering if you could speak to that or elaborate on that point, because I think it really ties these kind of conventional ideas of conflict resolution or alternative dispute resolution, but puts it allows this kind of out there mystical concept to connect back to something that's very practical in like the discipline of conflict resolution.
Yeah, in the same way that the peaceful warrior archetype was designed to be an integration or a simplification of what I mean by the interconnection between these points of resonance in mysticism and conflict transformation. What the compass is designed to do is to once again be like, well, how now that you have this peaceful warrior idea, great. Well, how would you go about using it or doing something with this? And the reason I framed it as a compass is, if you're trying to work from this elicitive perspective and then write about it, you always run into this difficulty of how do you propose something that's elicitive in a non-prescriptive way. And so I invoke the metaphor of the compass, because a compass helps you find your orientation, but it doesn't tell you where to go. And a compass in without relationship to something else doesn't really help you very much. If you don't have a compass and a map, you would need compass and a pretty good understanding of where you are to figure out where to go. And so in the place of the cardinal directions, I place this path, power, vision, and voice as, say, like orienting considerations. And then in each of these, I try to consider them following this Wilbur matrix of look at it, what does it mean for the individual and at the collective level, and the inside and the outside perspectives. And then I make parallels to different aspects of mysticism and then draw these connections to the different chakras. And then, it's kind of a tantric tool in that they all, in each of these considerations, they all repeat each other. So I think that the example that you brought up is a really good one, that this idea of how do we, a very practical tool that we see in peace work is this negotiate or mediation tool of helping people to move away from their stated positions, to have the awareness of what their needs are, or perhaps what their values are, and where are there things that are negotiable and non-negotiable. And so it softens what could seem as a irreconcilable contradiction. But this requires, it's something that sounds very easy. And when you look at the diagram in the book, it's just a nice little triangle. You bring up a nice little triangle and they fit together, and maybe there's an iceberg and you're like, great. But it's not so easy, because one is really requires for the individual the awareness to be able to separate from their needs, positions, and interests. On the side of the facilitator, of the mediator, how do you help someone to get to there? How do you, because it also requires being vulnerable and open, even to dismantle your own positionality is not a thing that anyone wants to do. That's really the
big question, right? Yeah. Is like, how does one person who, whatever is hurt or is a disagreeable person, and it's like, this is what I want, I'm not backing down from it. How does that person wake up one day and say, no, I'm going to tell you what I really need. I'm going to I'm going to be a fundamentally different person. Yeah. Maybe not necessarily fundamentally, but I'm going to be a different version of this of myself today. And like you said, that soften on that position, to be willing to take a risk, maybe trusting a little bit more. And that doesn't happen for nothing, right?
Well, especially in the context that we're talking about. So if already a mediator is involved between two parties, things are not going well, Oh, yeah. And so the idea of asking someone to move away from their position when they're already in a heated emotional moment, or a series of moments, or more likely a protracted series of repeating patterns, that's a big ask.
and also if you add into the places of like where does ADR or alternative dispute resolution often take place, and that's like in litigation.
Right.
like a mediator is called in so that you can settle out of court. And, like, I mean, that is a very like you said, there's been a lot of like bad blood that's already happened in order to get to that stage.
Well, and you think about the kind of physical context you would be in, right? Like if you usually when you ask someone to soften in this way and open up, you might be in a nice therapist's office or in some kind of yoga retreat with nice candles and stuff. But in this context, you're in a sterile courtroom or a conference room somewhere, and water bottles and stale cookies.
Yeah, but also on the other hand, I think one of the things that happens in this that is actually gives it a lot more hope or potential is that when you do go down that path of say litigation, is that maybe nobody ever asked what is it you really need? What are you feeling in this situation? What is it you really need? And when you name it, that actually was where the softening happens. It was like, fuck, finally somebody understands what I've been been trying to do. And it's like like the kind of like cliche scenario of like, it's not about the money. I need to feel respected. I needed to know that you care about me. Our relationship is the important. Can we continue to do business in the future? Those are the things that once they're named and there's someone sees it, someone sees that hurt or someone sees that injustice or perceived injustice, that is actually what it takes to shift, start to shift things, having a small opening.
One of the paradoxes, the types of paradoxes I talk about is complexity and simplicity, that they often happen at the same time. And I think this is a great example of it, because on one level, we're talking about how just a conflict between two people becomes so incredibly complicated with all these levels and layers over time. But then, just as you point out, where would someone have ever asked them, what is it you really need? Let alone, I mean, you might be asked, what do you want? But the idea of asking someone what do they need is very rarely something that happens in the formal kind of context.
Yeah, and authentically, and not done in a kind of flippant, accusatory or a sarcastic way, hurtful way. Yeah.
And if you think about how these issues are approached in psychotherapy, generally speaking, a very common technique is just naming the emotion, right? Like now I'm feeling anxious, now I'm feeling happy or depressed or whatever, and that it's the naming it actually decreases the intensity of it. And they've even shown this in brain scans, that it does change, because then it becomes from a subject to an object. You've named it, and it decreases the intensity of it. So once again, it's something so simple and so complicated coming together at the same moment.
I wanted to ask you about the maybe say something like that I might call a limitation of of bringing the two models together of power path vision voice and of the chakra system. Because the main chakra system has 7 chakras, whereas the power path vision voice is only 4. So you start at the 3rd chakra with being power, if I recall correctly, as the Manipura chakra. So then where do the lower and higher chakras fit in your model? So what about the Muladhara and Svadhisthana, and of course then like the
Sahasrara,
the crown
the
chakra.
big lotus.
So how does that fit, and maybe also talk about like the how you came to that choice of the 4 power path vision voice within this larger context of the chakra system.
The on one level, it was an intentional choice, because the idea was to focus on application. And so if I start with the second part of the question with the Sahasrara, the grand enlightenment chakra, my thought was, like, at that level, what we're talking about in the chakra system is the complete merger of the Atman, or the individual soul, with the Brahman, the universal consciousness. It is supreme merger with the Godhead, ultimate enlightenment. Which then, if I try to think about what does that mean as a consideration for applied peace work, I mean, it would be an interesting question to really go back to and revisit, getting the right people in the room to hash the idea out, because I do have a deep feeling there is something important with it there, but I don't know what it would be. You know, I had this when I started the research. I was at this Swami Veda's ashram, and you know, in typical ashram fashion, you have to wait a few weeks before you get your audience. So I'm hanging out and talking to all of the, like, I don't know, junior yogis or whatever you would call them, and I told them my research topic, and they gave me the answer that I would assume a yogi would give me, which is, actually, there is no such thing as conflict. It is only an illusion projected through the veil of Maya, the world of manifestness. And you're like, yeah, okay, well, cool.
The rest of us are
suffering and dying. Right? And then at one point we did this yoga nidra exercise, which is, you know, the idea to drop you all the way down into. So if you think about when you fall asleep, but your body's asleep, but your mind is awake, there's actually, you can go one more step further. So you can watch your mind fall asleep, but something still remains awake and conscious of your mind sleeping. And it's a weird technique, because you can't quite do it. The practices get you up to the point, but then there's no more doing because there's no more you. But in these little tastes of that, I was like, oh shit, like they are right in a way. Like from this perspective, it is right. There is no conflict because there is no subject and object. There's no separation. There's only suchness, being itself. But then again, I don't know what that means for applied peace work. And perhaps there is something there, and I don't know. Like, you know, one kind of easy answer is that that's the domain of the saints and high level mystics. But that's not very satisfactory to me, because I think it's also part and parcel of what it means to be a human being. And then on the other, go ahead.
No, you go ahead first.
No. I was going to just talk briefly about the bottom two chakras. My idea of leaving those out was, again, this idea of practical peace work. And I was looking more at how, roughly speaking, the parallels are drawn between Buddhist psychology, the chakra system, and developmental psychology. And there's this idea in Buddhist thought that there are certain things that form who we are before the emergence of the conscious mind. And the way that Buddhist psychology looks at the chakra system, they say these first two chakras are things that shape us before the mind is born. And so in that way, there's not really a direct way to work on them. They do have ideas about how to understand them and work with them, but it's not something that can be done in any kind of direct or applied way. Again, it would be an interesting question to come back to with the right people to hash it out and to really see, like, because on one idea, it's the realm of healing that might take place in, like, when people try to do like prenatal trauma healing or healing pre-birth trauma. And maybe there is something applicable there, but I don't exactly know what it would be. So I think these are definitely both areas open for more elaboration.
And also, just as the example you used, that this is one of the I think the difficulties of defining the scope of the international peace studies. So it's like, you know, perinatal reconstruction therapies, that can be a really good, useful tool to, you know, help somebody understand themselves, their place in the world, and maybe they will, have a better sense of themselves and engage in less conflict in their daily lives because of that. But that's not usually the kind of thing that is thought about or considered when in like the academic discipline of peace studies, which would be like, you know, on one hand, the kind of like conflict resolution skills, or, you know, multilateral diplomacy, and you know, blue helmets and that kind of thing. And so, yes, this kind of rituals or activities can help people, be more fully realized and actualized human beings, and can help, but it's not necessarily like you're talking about something like, how do we deal with like the kind of the small day-to-day conflicts?
Right. And I think particularly too, because there's also a constraint of form and method. So because this was part of a dissertation, you have to write something down. Mm-hmm. And so if you're talking about things at the high levels of enlightenment where there is no more separation between subject and object, that also means there can be no more language, because language depends on the separation between subject and object and observer and observed. Otherwise, you can't say anything about it. So then how are you going to write down, suchness? I mean, outside of a poem or a haiku. Or...
No, that reminds me of what I was going to just comment on about that. The point of like the higher level chakras is that like, one of my beliefs that has come out of this investigation of peace studies over the years is that one of the roles of these say mystical experiences or religious experiences, transpersonal experiences, or something that puts you, even if it's a brief glimpse of seeing the non-dual state, seeing that separateness is an illusion, is that it is fundamental to the basics of conflict resolution, of our basics of understanding conviviality, because it is through having those experiences that opens up the greater possibility of empathy with other people, with non-human entities, not non-human living or sort of scientifically non-living entities, precisely because the individual then has the lived experience of even if it's brief, and even if it was just a glimpse, just a taste of some kind of divine experience. And I believe that is the route that will push through the cognitive barriers that we put up.
I've often thought that there are some doors that are opened. When opened, they fall off the hinges. And and there's this story that I don't exactly know where it comes from. It's often told in the context of yoga, that it's a story of a man who's locked in a dark room and he's terrified of the snake in the corner, and he's so afraid, he's overwhelmed with fear. And then for just a moment, there's a flash of lightning, and he sees that it's actually a coiled up rope in the corner. Yeah. He'll never again be afraid of the snake, even though he's back in darkness. He is somehow different from that glimpse. Yeah.
That's exactly the point. Yeah. No, now that you read all these books and you thought about it for years, one of the things that is like one of the starting points that you wrote about in like the introduction to your thesis that I wanted to ask you about is what is your stance on the perennial philosophy now?
Yeah, I was thinking about that today, and it's a bit funny when you are tracking these debates throughout history, particularly in academia. So I'd say like in the last 20 or so years, there hasn't seemed to have been too much interest in studying mysticism as a phenomenon outside of particular niche disciplines.
Thanks to the neoliberals.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, I would say maybe in the realm of religious studies, of course, and also in terms of understanding what these experiences do to the brain. I think that research has kept on going. But there seemed to be a period from the mid-'60s through the '80s where there was a lot of academic debate about mysticism. And one of them focused on this question of the perennial philosophy. But the perennial philosophy is the idea that all of these different spiritual practices and experiences of all of the traditions around the world, are they really just different ways of talking about the same thing? Is the divinity experience or the Godhead experience you get, is it the same thing, and then you interpret it differently? In the idea of integral psychology, they say that all states of consciousness are, as an experience, are the same. So as a human being, if I experience a non-dual state of awareness for a moment, that's the same as anyone else anywhere else experiencing it. But then whatever program I'm running in my NOA operating system interprets it as I come back into my day-to-day life. So if I'm a conservative Christian, I see that as being born again. That's how I understand it. Or if I'm a yoga practitioner, I see it as a temporary touching of samadhi, or a touching into non-dual awareness. And then the other view is more of a constructivist lens, that actually these things are all not connected, that they don't represent some kind of transcendental order, and that we actually are just kind of, each one kind of constructs itself in its own meaning-making system. And there seemed to be a lot of debate about this and never came to any resolution. I would say that the people that support the perennialist school of thought are more famous, or like there's a lot of people that you would recognize from this line of thought who went on to do other things. And it's an area that I know I'm biased in, because my experience of these things to me says that the perennialist idea is something that's closer to whatever is true, or whatever is the reality of the situation. But I don't know if the question is about the realness, right? Is it actually talking about some kind of transcendental order, some kind of universal guiding principle, some Tao that shapes how the universe lives and breathes that you're touching into? And this I have not fully understood yet, but it's still my instinct that something along the lines of the perennial philosophy is where I would position myself.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think you changed from writing this thesis?
Yeah,
what did you get out of it?
I think there were a few things. One is that it gave me the space and the permission to engage seriously with a lot of topics that have been important to me for a long time. Mm-hmm. And it also made me more comfortable in like describing myself as someone who is I would say that I'm mystically oriented rather than religious or spiritual, because neither of those two other words, being religious or spiritual, I never really felt a connection to. But after going through this process, I feel that more resonates with me. And I think that having touched it, because to really survey these topics, like I think my bibliography is like 45 pages long. Like you have to really, there's a lot of things to go through. And there are just so many moments where I see some little piece of information I picked up somewhere becomes really helpful in a totally weird situation, with an armed group in Myanmar jungle somewhere. And I'm like so glad that I had happened to know this idea that gives me the inspiration to take a certain meeting one way or a different way. Mm-hmm. And it definitely has kind of kept an anchor of my attention always towards the mystery and how the mystery unfolds. Mm-hmm. And also, not that I've ever been a person that's very oriented towards certainty, but it definitely has decreased my need for certainty, knowing that the main orienting principle for me has always been the mystery and the unfolding of it itself. So I think that kind of confirmation and expansion would be the two overarching themes that I took away from it. Although, to be fair, for the first 6 months afterwards, I couldn't read anything about mysticism. I was like, I need to be done reading all of these books for a little while.
Oh, very understandable. Also, on this kind of spirit of concluding this conversation, is you and I both defended our theses in 2016, which is now 5 years ago. I mean, the time flies, eh? And so now that we're talking about this process that probably started maybe about 10 years ago in its more concrete form, and it's 5 years since you defended, and kind of revisiting this and talking about it in depth today, what do you notice that you've learned about your topic since you wrote it? Maybe I'll think of another way of asking it. Because I guess the kind of thing that I was kind of getting at, I was thinking about, myself and some of the choice of the models that I use to compare things. Like looking at now that it's all done, I think yes, yeah, it was good. It was fine to do it, but it's probably not the best, like the most useful model. And so, like one of the things I think I've learned about my topic since then has been coming from like hearing people talking, like say on interviews, podcasts, the radio, about things related to my topic. I don't know if this is really going to a concrete answer, but I hear them talking about
it's interesting.
It's like, oh, they should read my thesis because, like, you know, or like they in one way they're kind of scooping my topic, but also because like I think if they read my thesis, they would have like that could be useful for them.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that I've been trying to do, and I think that I've learned, is trying to say like, how can I distill it more into some like basic principles or things like to be able to share with other people, because this big complex 400-page verbose doctoral thesis is not helpful for people, but maybe something like this YouTube video where you break it, talk about it and break it down, even if it's still academic language and a bit verbose, that maybe it's a little bit more accessible.
I mean, I think that's a very good point. And I have, maybe it sounds self-serving to say, but I have had the feedback of quite a number of people who've actually read the entirety of the text and been like, this was very important to me, and it told me different ways that it's changed their life or approach to things. And to people that I've kind of presented the idea to more informally, they're like, wow, this is something that I really needed to know or to think about this way, or something I wish I would have learned at one point. But I have exactly the same thought as you, is, well, asking anyone to read a 500-page academic thing that's a non-starter, I think. And then the question is, well, what kind of format does this thing take? And I don't have a good answer to it, because I've thought of different ideas. Like, well, one is like you could write a book, but a shorter, more concise book. But then does it fit into the area of self-help, or like, I don't exactly want to do that. Do you make an online course and like do that whole thing? Or I don't know what the answer is, but I think generally speaking, there is a need for figuring out how to do precisely what we're talking about here. And I've heard other academics say this too, and I just imagine the wealth of information and experience that exists out there as unpublished dissertations, or even published dissertations that nobody will ever read, because usually when they're published that way, they cost $200, and you have to order the hard copy from a library or something. But I think it is really an important question on how do we take the essence, exactly what you're saying, the distillation of these kinds of ideas, that we can see that they're important, and get it to people in a way that can be easily accessed. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think that's part of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great note to close on, because I mean that's precisely what we're doing here. To try to this is like the old, the Cole's Notes. This is kind of the Cole's Notes version to your thesis. So if you don't have whatever 40 hours to spare to read the entire text, you could put this on in the background while you're washing the dishes, or I don't know, driving the car or something, and kind of get a little little master class in mysticism and conflict transformation. So on that note, thank you, Noah, for taking the time to delve back into this topic that you spent so much time reading and writing about. It's been a pleasure for me to take on this role of interviewer or interlocutor for this discussion, and I look forward to doing this again. We're going to do it again for the next episode. We're going to switch roles and talk about my thesis, and hopefully in the near future we will bring in other guests and talk about their research thesis, book, or whatever it is that there's their area of expertise.
Wonderful, and thanks for the space to share these things. I was very happy to touch back in with them. So I guess until the next episode.
Thank you and goodbye.